Labour Party created the NHS in 1948 to be there for everyone, rich and poor, at the point of need, free at the point of use. In 2012, the NHS was the best healthcare system in the world. But after so many years of cuts and privatisation, it's really suffering. That's why, ahead of the next general election, we're calling on the Labour Party, the party that created the NHS, to reinstate it as a fully public service. Welcome, everyone. My name's Kat, and this is We Own It Live. We Own It campaigns for public ownership. We believe in public services for people, not profit, and we want to do something about it. If you do too, please smash that like button and subscribe to us. Thank you so much for being here. Please do put your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them when we get to the Q&A. So today I'm talking to Johnbosco, who is our lead campaigner campaigning on the NHS. Hi, Johnbosco. So our NHS has been privatised in so many different ways. And today we're going to talk through for people the different ways in which it has been privatised and then what we can do about it and why in particular we're calling on Keir Starmer to reinstate the NHS. Obviously, it's fairly obvious. We think that he might be the next Prime Minister. And if he is, we think that's possibly the best chance that we're going to ever get to get our NHS back the way that it was intended. So we're going to just talk through a bit to start with some of the ways in which the NHS has been privatised. I'm going to kick us off with a history, Johnbosco, but jump in as you like and give your thoughts. So obviously the NHS created in 1948, but the sort of the privatisation, the marketisation of it started well before this government. We had in the 1990s the creation of the internal market, where internally different bits of the NHS were split, what they called the purchaser-provider split. So, you know, one bit of the NHS was the purchaser, the other was the provider, which hadn't been the case before. And we also had private finance initiatives, which we're still suffering from. Absolutely astonishing how much money we're spending, hospital trusts today are spending because of those deals that were done. Private finance initiatives were essentially a way of bringing in the private sector to help fund infrastructure in the NHS, to build new hospitals. And it didn't work because we're paying far more because of involving the private sector. So hospital trusts are also, foundation trusts are suffering because of all of the money that they owe, that they have to keep on paying out because of these private sector deals. But I think probably what we'll do today is sort of focus on 2012 onwards, with that being said, because 2012 was really a key moment when the Health and Social Care Act opened up a market, a sort of external market in our NHS, and opened the door to competition and private providers jumping into to run services. So locally, that means that NHS trusts outsource contracts to private companies. Of course, nationally, NHS England also outsources work to private companies. For example, the 33 billion that was wasted on private test and trace contract during the pandemic, which is money that could have been spent on local public health teams. The 2012 Act also allowed foundation trusts to obtain 49% of their income from private patients. So that was a really key development. And it also led to more joint ventures with private companies. And all of that, all of those moves have been reducing the funding available for the NHS and undermining it, and just sort of increasing the private sector's role in the NHS. And we know that privatisation kills. Let's turn to the second slide, which was our demonstration earlier this year. So research from Oxford University came out looking at what's happened because of that outsourcing, because of the 2012 Act. And there have been 557 excess deaths because of that decision to open up the NHS to outsourcing. And of course, more generally speaking, we know that privatisation kills as well. So when you compare us to America, the mortality rates, the deaths are much, much higher. And of course, people are getting into financial trouble with bankruptcies. So we then see in 2022 the Health and Care Act, and obviously you were campaigning on that, Johnbosco. So do you want to maybe tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone who's joining us this afternoon for this discussion. I did want to say a little bit about, you started off with the history of how privatization kind of came into the NHS. I think something that you'll always find politicians who are, I suppose, in favor of privatization, mainly conservative politicians, but also some Labour politicians increasingly, will say, well, the private sector has always had a part in the NHS, and they'll always point at GPs, for example, right? GPs as having been independent contractors. And it's really, really important that people are aware that even that element that they like to think about as private, which are private GPs, it's essentially the case that these were not commercial entities in kind of in the sense that a company like Centene or Operos is today, right? These were essentially mom and pop, for want of a better description, GPs who had a contract only with the NHS. They were not allowed to advertise their services to other kinds, to other clients. Their pay was determined by the NHS. Pretty much every aspect of the work they did was informed and kind of enforced by the NHS. That's not a private company. And as a matter of fact, the law itself determined, and this is something that is related to the question you asked about the 2012 Act, or what you mentioned about the 2012 Act earlier. The law itself recognized that there was a fundamental difference between GP surgeries, the traditional GP kind of partnership, and these private companies who are coming in like Centene, right? So until quite recently, um, you were not companies that were led by people who are not GPs could not run GP surgeries, but they had to, I think it was in 2004, if I'm not mistaken, create a whole new contract called APMS contract, Alternative Provided Medical Services contracts, which allowed a company like Centene that's not run by GPs to run GP surgeries, right? So even the law had recognized that there is a difference between a traditional GP surgery, which politicians like to pretend was private companies within the NHS, and the role of Centene. To kind of come in a little bit back to the discussion about the Health and Care Act that passed last year in April and came into force in July. A lot of people that are watching this call right now will be kind of aware of a lot of the work that we did around then. We kind of decided to take a two-pronged approach to it. We first of all recognized, obviously, that integrated care systems were, in effect, the NHS being internally transformed to make it more amenable to the market structures that some of these NHS leaders wanted to see within it, right? But also, there were elements of it that we thought were even more insidious. So we, for example, we're campaigning against private companies sitting on the boards of integrated care systems. We were campaigning around the question of making the NHS a default provider of care, especially on the question of scrapping Section 75, right? Section 75 is the element of the 2012 Act that introduced compulsory commissioning and competition for the provision of services between NHS trusts and private companies, right? So we put a lot of pressure on politicians around those issues then, and we actually managed to get the government to pass a relatively weak but not altogether toothless amendment to the bill that banned private companies from sitting on those boards, right? But altogether, generally speaking, that bill, I think, moved us a little bit further in the direction of NHS privatization, and I think we absolutely need to be demanding right now that Keir Starmer step up. After 13 years of conservative governments, 5 conservative prime ministers pushing the privatization agenda, it's really time for Keir Starmer to step up and protect the legacy of his party, really, because that's what the NHS is.
Yes, totally. And I think, the campaigning that you were doing and that some of the people on this call were involved in and leading on, and Keep NHS Public were doing, we were doing a lot of pragmatic campaigning, in the context of this government, trying to limit the damage of the Health and Care Act as much as possible, trying to stop some of the worst excesses, like having private companies sitting on boards. But now politically, we're in a different situation where, we are going into the next general election fairly soon, and we need to think about proactively calling for what we actually want, rather than just trying to stop the worst aspects of what's going on. But I think it's important just to explain as well the picture of, so you had some aspects of marketisation pre-2012. You had the 2012 Act, and all of the opening up of markets that did. And then in 2022, I want to just read you what Professor Alison Pollock says about this, because she is one of the co-authors of the NHS Reinstatement Bill, which is a bit of legislation that describes how we could get our NHS back. And she sees the 2022 Health and Care Act as really a kind of crucial, almost final step in what's happened with the privatisation of the NHS. So she says, the Act creatively develops further the market paradigm and reduces local accountability under the warm rubric of integration and innovation. And we heard a lot about that, didn't we, during the Act's passing. She says, it completes the detachment of funding, planning and provision from local residents and local areas, thereby breaking decisively with the Beveridge/Bevan model. So, the original model of the NHS is there for all of us. It's a national service. Wherever you are in the country, you can access it. What this Act did was it created 42 separate integrated care boards, essentially carving up the NHS and then bringing in provider collaboratives, which involve private companies. And she sees that, Alison Pollock sees that as very much a US concept. And a US model involving these private companies and provider collaboratives.
Can I quickly jump in there about provider collaboratives? So it's quite interesting that the NHS has never been really clear what they mean by provider collaboratives. I did quite a bit of research around it when I first found out about them to find out what exactly are these things. And I don't think that I think that they know what it is, in the sense that, as Alison Pollock's article says, Simon Stevens, the former Director General, I think they're called, I've forgotten exactly what it's called now, the leader of NHS England, who is now in the House of Lords, essentially, without passing legislation, already started changing the NHS internally in terms of the way the NHS works. So my suspicion is that they actually understand what provider collaboratives are internally, because they've changed it enough that it's common sense to them. But externally, what it looks like it is are essentially this new body, these integrated care boards sit at the top of the NHS at the 42 sub-regions across England. And within each integrated care system that's led by a board, there's going to be a provider collaborative. And every NHS trust and foundation trust in that area needs to be a part of that provider collaborative. Private companies and other kinds of smaller trusts are also allowed to be a part of it if they want to, and if they think it, quote unquote, serves the local community. Nobody knows exactly what that actually means in practice. But in effect, what's going to happen is that, whereas in the former system, where CCGs, clinical commissioning groups, were the bodies that used to make decisions about commissioning NHS care for that area, that responsibility now falls to the Integrated Care Board. But then the board is allowed to delegate that responsibility to the provider collaboratives. And the provider collaboratives don't actually need to carry out any kind of commissioning or process to decide who's going to run that service. They're members of the collaborative, and they could just decide, you are going to run it, you are going to run this, you're going to do that, without any commissioning process, without any transparency. And I think this is part of what's going to kind of move our NHS more in the direction of private companies just becoming normal, in the internal process of the NHS, and becoming normal, getting contracts without any kind of process that can be scrutinized publicly, and that's a deep crisis in the NHS that is allowed to happen.
Right. So they took out in the 2022 Act, they took out some of the processes that had been there, which obviously we maybe didn't like those processes when they were about the internal market. But now that you've got these external companies involved, essentially getting rid of any process opens the door to cronyism. But I think Alison Pollock makes another, and Peter Roderick, the co-authors of the NHS Reinstatement Bill, make another really important point around this, which is the Secretary of State's duty to provide healthcare to everyone was taken away with the 2012 Act. And what this further act has done is it's essentially sort of strengthened that, or rather reduced that further, limited that duty to provide and made it really muddling who is actually in charge. So, you go to your ICS, but actually they can outsource the work to the provider collaboratives. What you don't have is that kind of straightforward duty on the minister for the whole of the country to provide healthcare. And there was this story that we just saw today of a woman in Wales who is struggling to get the care that she needs. She's been trying to get an operation for 2 years. She's in a huge amount of pain. And the Welsh government has actually been quoted in this article. It's kind of horrifying, saying the Welsh government does not provide, because health has been devolved. The Welsh government does not provide funding for individual NHS procedures. That's the responsibility of the health boards concerned. And where required, health boards have processes in place to arrange for appropriate treatments to be delivered in other health boards. Now, I don't know if there's any difference between what's happening in Wales and what's happening in England, but it sounds like a similar pattern. Maybe you can add to that, Johnbosco, but it sounds like a similar pattern where, you would expect that the government is ultimately responsible for your healthcare. That was the deal when the NHS was created. But now it's kind of, you can't any longer rely on that. And you're relying on this health board, which, by the way, will also be, effectively rationing the services that it provides. So what Alison Pollock says is you end up with this kind of rump service where you have fewer services available. And if you want to complain about it, the government isn't responsible anymore. They don't have that duty to provide. So, that's why we're saying, actually, we can have nice words from the Labour Party about, a wave of insourcing, and that's good. We do want insourcing in general. But when it comes to the NHS, just saying, let's insource some more contracts isn't actually sufficient, because what we need to do is we need to take back the NHS to what it was supposed to be. We need to reinstate that duty on the Secretary of State to provide healthcare to everyone. And we need to be really clear about that. So we need to get private companies totally out of the NHS in all their different forms, whether we're talking about private finance, whether we're talking about local contracts, national contracts, whether we're talking about decision making that they may be involved in. We need to end that. And then we need to say, actually, we don't want this carved up, chopped up NHS anymore. We want an NHS that will deliver a reliable service to everyone, and that will deliver the comprehensive range of services that people need, so that you can actually rely on it. Because it's all very well saying, as many Conservative politicians do, the NHS will always be free at the point of use. But if there's very little service left, it kind of doesn't matter if it's free. So we need the full range of every kind of healthcare that people need, rather than this sort of, cutting back, encroaching on what we can expect.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there are two things there, right? There is one, who gets care in the NHS, and I think by and large that's the question that's dealt with that Alison Pollock and Peter Roderick deal with, under the question of the Secretary of State's duty to provide care to everyone, and they kind of draw a really worrying kind of, if you like, time map of, we started off with the Secretary of State being legally responsible. So if you don't get care, you could sue the Secretary of State and win some kind of compensation, right? But then that being scrapped, and now your entitlement to care depends not on you being in a particular geographic location, but you being registered with a GP surgery within that particular location. Well, what if you're visiting your uncle or your aunt or your mother or father or somebody in another part of the country, and let's say you fall off a bicycle and you go to the hospital there? And I actually read a story yesterday. I believe it was a story that was linked within Alison Pollock's article, of somebody who was turned away from two different hospitals, if I'm not mistaken. I think that happened in Manchester. The more I talk about it, the more the story comes back to mind, because it was a very stark story. Somebody was turned away from two different hospitals for reasons related to a policy that was put in place that ensures that people get care from the hospitals as closest to their house, right? This is a byproduct of the Secretary of State no longer being responsible for the care that everybody got. And at the beginning of the NHS existence, this particular piece of the law was thought to imply that the Secretary of State needed to make provision to provide hospitals, to provide GP surgeries, to provide every element of every step of our healthcare system, right? But scrapping that, therefore, now means, well, not everybody is entitled to care. You might be English, you might be born in England, and you think, well, I'm entitled to care in England. Well, you may be entitled to care in Newcastle, but not in Oxford, all right? So that is a deeply problematic element of things. But there's obviously that other element of, as time passes, the number of things that we are forced to pay for increases, right? We are now forced to, a vast majority of us are now forced to pay for dental care, for eye care, for all sorts of other kinds of things, that kind of the principle of paying for your care is kind of getting more enriched within the NHS. And it's it's really, really important, right, to kind of reel this a little bit back into the demand of our campaign. It's really, really important that we are demanding of Keir Starmer and of all of the parties, to be totally honest, but quite important that we put pressure on Keir Starmer, because we think the polling suggests that they're in a strong position to win the next election. We put pressure on them to say to them, enough of this kind of financial meanderings within the NHS. We want a healthcare system that's designed to work for people and not for profit. It's time to reinstate it to what Nye Bevan had in mind and what he created at the beginning. The BMA could have discussions with a West Streeting or a future Keir Starmer government about the GP structure, and I'm sure that they are perfectly capable of coming up with plans that work for patients and doctors at the primary care level. What we care about is that our NHS should work for people again, and we're moving further and further away from that, from where it was when our NHS worked for people and not profit.
Yeah, absolutely. So do sign that petition. We just had the link in the chat. Sign the petition to Keir Starmer. Labour Party conference starts on Sunday. Keir Starmer's speech will be on Tuesday. So we're really trying to push this petition ahead of that conference and that speech, to send a really clear message to Starmer. And we will be to that. But
yeah, I was just about to say what you wanted to say, and we will be at Labour conference as well. We're taking action outside Labour conference at the Wheel of Liverpool, if you're there, to essentially say to Keir Starmer, reinstate the NHS as a fully public service. Just to kind of say a little bit about our theory in taking that action, we've kind of worked on what we think is going to be a really eye-catching, kind of striking action that tells a story of the last 13 years of private companies during the tenure of each of the last 5 Tory prime ministers cutting into the NHS. So we're going to have people dressed up as the last 5 Tory prime ministers. Each of them will be carrying a large prop knife with the logo of a private company associated with their time in government. And we think that this kind of visual, and every time I've described it to somebody in the press, they've found it to be quite striking, and they've been quite interesting. So fingers crossed that we get good coverage, right? And if we do, we might then be able to put ourselves in a position to get a lot more people, not just within our circles and in the public, but in the press talking about it. And I think the moment that this begins to cut through into the press, hopefully we begin to see Labour being asked questions about what they're going to do about the NHS, because obviously the government has taken a significant amount of the brunt at the moment, fairly, as a matter of fact. But Labour does need to make its hand clear. What are you going to do about the NHS? And what we are saying to them they should do about the NHS is reinstate it as a fully public service. And we're far past the time to depend on the private sector to solve this problem. The private sector cannot solve this problem. And you will be aware of our Only the NHS campaign. We know the private sector does not have A&Es. And something you might not actually know, I'm going to finish on this now, so Kat can come back in. Every single month in England, 550 people are transferred from private hospitals to NHS hospitals because they had an emergency in the private hospitals, right? So the private hospitals have no A&E. If you have an emergency, they cannot help you. That's number one. The private hospitals do not have staff. And what we are in the midst of at the moment, we're in the midst of a waiting list crisis. But over and above that, we're really in the midst of a staffing crisis, right? That's the reason why the waiting lists are really what they are at the moment, in addition to privatization and funding cuts. And the private sector does not train staff. They essentially poach staff that have been trained, according to analysis by the Center for Health and the Public Interest, have been trained to the tune of about £8.7 billion by the public, right? We train them, we have the framework for training them within the NHS, and the private sector steals them, right? So the private sector cannot help us with this. And finally, we know that they only treat those that are profitable, right? If your case is not profitable, they're not going to treat you. And even if it's profitable and they treat you, and even if you pay out of pocket for it, if there is a complication, they cannot help you. You have to get help from the NHS, right? So it's really, really important that we are making sure that Labour understands. We know that the private sector cannot solve this problem. So you cannot continue the problem of, well, we're going to use capacity in the private sector. There is no capacity there. They cannot help us. It's really important that they do what's right from the start, not first give themselves an opportunity to fail with a strategy that's going to fail. Yes, and that's why we're pushing them on this really important issue.
Yeah. And I think Labour has made some noises around saying we need the NHS to be good enough that people don't need to turn to the private sector. But they've often kind of really muddied the waters by talking about the role of the private sector and implying that that's needed in some way. So we've got some great questions coming in. So Liz says, can you spell out how privatisation directly impacts on funding? You started spelling it out with PFI contracts. So Liz, I think there's a few different ways. So so obviously PFI debts that foundation trusts have to continue paying out, sometimes up to around 13% of their income on servicing these PFI debts. I've found a few other ways, I think, partly drawing on what Johnbosco just said. So, privatisation impacts on funding because the doctors that work in the private sector, that's essentially draining staff out of the NHS. Now, that's not directly on money, but it's resources, being taken out of the NHS. Same with A&E, the private sector's reliance on A&E. And same with the fact that the private sector, as Johnbosco said, kind of cherry picks the easy cases. And as soon as things get complicated, it goes, the patients have to go back to the NHS for that to be dealt with. The study on outsourcing by Oxford University also said that one of the reasons why outsourcing has led to excess deaths is because of one possible reason is cutting corners. So, again, you're kind of seeing that. I mean, that's not directly about funding, but it's a kind of wasteful approach to our healthcare, and it's providing a worse service, so it's definitely less efficient. And then, of course, there's a kind of obvious kind of huge COVID contracts that went out to people who happen to know MPs or Conservative ministers, and the huge waste of that, again, is draining resources from the NHS, resources that could have been put into public health teams. So that's sort of off the top of my head, but maybe other people have ideas that they can put in the chat as well, or maybe you have more thoughts, Johnbosco.
Yes, I did just want to point out, so there are a number of ways that privatization is obviously extremely wasteful. One of them you've pointed out already, that if you have allocated, let's say you've allocated £20 million for the provision of hip replacements for a particular area, and you give the contract for that to Spire Health, the private healthcare company, you know for sure that if a fraction of that, it could be 10%, it could be 15%, doesn't matter, is going to profits, right? Essentially, you have carved off 15% of that £20 million that will not go to providing hip replacement. They might say to you, well, we're going to do it more efficiently. Well, we don't actually, private healthcare is not an area where we don't think the NHS does an efficient job. The NHS actually does an incredibly efficient job, and it has a track record of doing an efficient job. Analysis show that the private sector and the NHS on certain procedures have about the same kind of quality of service. Now, the difference is, and this is the second element of the wastage, is that I gestured to this earlier. If you had a complication in the private sector does not kind of carry on that follow-up care, right? The thing that happens after you've had a kidney operation, and then your body begins to not want that kidney, or something happens. They don't deal with the follow-up. The NHS does the follow-up, right? The private sector just does that one thing and moves on, and that's part of the analysis that that the Oxford study actually did. It says essentially that carving out contracts and giving the most profitable bits to the private sector leaves the NHS with less money, but with the most complicated cases to deal with, right? So some of the people who would have died may have actually died within the NHS, but they only died because the NHS was not itself properly funded enough to deal with this situation. Another element, and Kat mentioned this earlier, is PFIs, and it's quite important. It's been a development today, actually. And if you're subscribed to the newsletters for the Center for Health and the Public Interest, you would have received an email from them today where they were essentially talking about, I think, as a result of inflation, the private companies who hold these PFI contracts with NHS trusts have made around £460 million in profits, over and above what they were supposed to make. And this is money coming out of the budgets of NHS trusts and foundation trusts. And one leader of an NHS trust actually said that this is going to be potentially financially ruinous for their trust, right? So these are things that were incredibly short-sighted when they happened, but in some ways we are actually being quite stupid in allowing it to continue to go on. I saw an analysis recently that said it is actually possible that we could scrap a number of these PFI contracts because the terms of those contracts have actually been breached by those private companies, right? Those are things that if Labour was serious about reinstating the NHS, they can do. And I think we can put them under enough pressure to force them to do those things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just outrageous, the situation that we're in. And I think, there's so much talk about, can we afford the NHS? But actually so little of that analysis and asking that question actually recognises the role of outsourcing and privatisation and private finance, over the past 30 years, really, in draining the NHS of the resources that it needs. And that needs to be recognised. If a foundation trust is spending that much of its income on PFI, that alone is a huge drain that doesn't need to be happening. So we've got questions. So Ron says, playing devil's advocate, why should patients be interested if the care they're receiving is being provided by a private firm commissioned by the NHS? So I think, Ron, I know that you agree with us on this, but it's a really good question. So first of all, check out the video that me and Johnbosco did a few weeks ago, looking at how the private sector can actually be really unsafe for patients. Not to scare you, but sometimes they are cutting corners, and you might not get the quality of care that you want from the private sector. Secondly, obviously the way, as we've described, I think you might be concerned as a patient that the private sector is kind of drawing resources out of the NHS, taking profit away, using up doctors' time on an operation. And obviously, people will have to go private if they can afford it, if they're desperate. Some people will go private, and we're not blaming anyone for that. But it's most people who end up having to go private would probably much prefer not to have to pay, to get a high standard of care, and to know that they're being treated within the NHS. And then I think the third thing is that long-term impact, really, because that draining of resources over time is undermining the NHS. And so I think it's really sad for people, actually, and frustrating to have to go private when they would rather not, and when they believe in the NHS. So there's no judgment around that, but actually the NHS needs to be there for all of us. That's what people want, and that's what we should have. There's no reason why we can't have that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly, there's actually research on that question of whether people would like to go private versus the NHS. There are two things involved. Obviously, Ron's question is dealing specifically with people who are sent to the private sector by the NHS and paid for by the NHS. I think it's fairly clear to people that the vast majority of us would not want to pay for our care, right? So that's why we have the NHS, and that's why the NHS works so well. But the IPPR, the Institute for Public Policy Research, did some analysis last year and actually found that I think something approaching 85% of the public, for one reason or the other, do not want to go to the private sector for whatever reason, right? So about 55% of people would much rather just use the NHS. There is a significant percentage that actually thinks that even if they're about to die, they don't want to go to the private sector, they want to use the NHS, right? So there are a whole bunch of different motivations that people have for wanting to use the NHS. And that makes a lot of sense. The NHS, everybody that's watching this right now, and everybody in Britain has a good NHS story, either for themselves or a member of their family. And they care about the NHS. Somebody said in the past, I've forgotten exactly who, that the NHS is the closest thing that the English have to a religion. And God forbid me to talk about religion, but it is actually true. People love the NHS, and it's because it saved their lives in the past, saved the lives of people in their families. We should preserve the NHS. Giving money to the private sector for contracts only builds up the power of the private sector, and we're already seeing them demanding for higher payment for providing the same service as NHS trusts and foundation trusts are doing. And the more power we give to them by building them up, the more they're going to demand in the future, right? And ultimately, that's going to cost the NHS and reduce the quality of the service that we're getting from the NHS. So there are two elements there, right? One of them is as a patient, which I agree with Keir totally. I cannot blame anybody for wanting relief from their pain and then going to the private sector as a result of that, if they are able to help them. What I can say, and I think everybody that's watching this and everybody in the public will agree with, is that we cannot do that at the expense of the NHS. We need to fund the NHS properly so anybody who needs care gets it where they actually want to get it, which is in the NHS.
Yeah, exactly. And, we know from privatisation in general that when you involve the private sector in providing an essential public service that people have no choice but to use, the prices don't go down, they go up. Look at water, look at energy, look at public transport. None of those experiments have gone well. So why would we think that it's going to be any better, especially when we look at the US? And Ruth says, from what I've seen of Starmer, the US vultures have landed. Labour's cabinet have accepted large bribes from US private health companies. It's extremely worrying. Yes, that's why we need to turn things around as soon as we can. We need to really ramp up the pressure on this one, because there's nothing more important, I don't think, that a Labour government could do, first policy in office. So there's no easy answers to how we push them to do this, but we have to campaign for this. And yes, and Maggie says, talking about the way that the privatisation has happened and the Health and Care Act, this is going back to the so-called postcode lottery, which was the reason NICE was set up, to avoid this and have guidance across all England and Wales. Yeah, and it's also the reason the NHS was invented, right? In 1948, to avoid this postcode lottery where you know, depending whether you're poor or rich, depending where you live in the country, there's some hodgepodge of services. You know, the fact that we're going sort of leaning back in that direction is really, you know, the opposite of progress. And so we can't have that. We need to have our NHS back. Thank you everyone for being here. It's been great to have your comments and questions in the chat, and thank you for spending this time with us. If you're going to be in Liverpool for Labour Party conference, look out for us on Monday morning at the Wheel of Liverpool, where we'll be sending that message to Keir Starmer to reinstate the NHS as a fully public service. If you haven't signed the petition, please sign it, and please do share it with your friends and family. We'll also put in the links in the description on this video an article by Professor Alison Pollock, which explains how our National Health Service has been dismantled over the years, and we've been drawing on that article really heavily. So that's the original source. Thanks for being here. Please do subscribe, like this video, comment in the chat, not just in the chat that we've got going now, but do leave a comment on this video when it goes live. And we will see you next Thursday, we hope, at 5 p.m. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.